Thank you, everyone. So my name is Jen Mapes, and I'm a professor at Kent State. I wanted to start with a few caveats, which is I'm generally an urban geographer. I'm someone who makes maps kind of for fun, for volunteer, for all sorts of different reasons, and didn't really study cartography professionally or academically, but I love maps like you guys do. So this talk is actually the perfect combination of my research on small towns and my interest in cartography. And so I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of mapping US small towns, which is something I run into a lot, and some of the possible solutions I've come up with. And so the other caveat is that let's look at these maps as kind of sketches. I, as a cartography professor, would not approve of all of my maps. So hopefully you guys will look kindly upon my maps and kind of think about them generally. And it's super apologies to Alaska and Hawaii who get left off. All right, so why even bother mapping small towns? I don't see very many maps of small towns, especially at the national scale. But since my research is on small towns, I have a very strong argument to make about small towns should be counted as urban areas, and that they actually have really important, interesting things are happening there, and that we should recognize and differentiate the small town from surrounding rural areas. So way too often I hear small towns and rural areas, and they get grouped together as doing certain things in this kind of uniform way. And I strongly believe that they're actually quite different from rural areas. And that interesting things happen there, which is the exact opposite theory that my advisor had, so we got along really well. He was really big on large cities, global cities, and so I thought small towns actually have really interesting things happening and they shouldn't be ignored. And yet again, one of these problems that kind of arises from people's tendency to lump small towns together with rural areas is that really we have a lot of perceptions. We got Stars Hollow, you can't quite see it, Stars Hollow there, right? So ideas about small towns, and they're cute and they're quirky or they're dying, and they're terrible places to live, right? We have ideas about small towns, and I really feel like our perceptions about small towns outweigh our actual knowledge and understanding about small towns, thus the importance of mapping them, researching them, et cetera. So one of the first problems that you encounter when you're trying to map small towns is, what is a small town? Which is like people's favorite question to ask me about my research. Is like, what do you think a small town is? So the starting point for me is to say that we typically talk about this dichotomy in which we have kind of rural areas or urban. And I'm trying to kind of tease that out a little bit more and say, well, we have actually this kind of variety of densities and population quantities, and small towns obviously are small, and so they're not these very large population areas, but they could be a medium population area, or maybe a low population area, and have a medium to high density. They're not going to be low density places. These are relatively high density locations. They just happen to be smaller than large cities. So there's a couple ways we can then use census data to try to find these places. So the most obvious one would be to look for the name, so CDP, census designated place, to look for these names of particular small towns that exist that are official, and then look at their population. But what happens is, and I'm trying to kind of diagram that out, is that we end up with, we do a pretty good job of separating out these large cities with large populations, and a somewhat good job of finding small towns that have smaller populations. But one of the things that really jumped out at me was our tendency to then say, and there's actually journal articles that are published this way that study small towns, but they're actually studying suburbs. So that's what the little gray dot next to the big gray dot, that's a place that, yeah, it's got a separate, you've probably all been to or lived in places like this. They are technically their own city boundaries, but they are truly a suburb and have never really been their own kind of separate place outside of the city. So the census actually has a pretty good solution for that. They have something called the urban cluster and the urban area. And those are places that are determined not at all by place names or place boundary, like municipal boundaries, but actually by density. So you start with a core area, 1,000 people per square mile in the center area, and then you keep going out, and as soon as you drop below 500 people per square mile, you're not in the urban area anymore. And then you separate out places that are, the gray area is this kind of, has the core, the dense urban core, that's the big circle. You go outwards, once you drop off in terms of density, that's an area that would be 50,000 people and above. So the census would call that an urban area. And then those smaller areas have a population between 2,500 and 50,000. So those are small towns, urban clusters. And so that's actually a pretty good definition, and that's what I've actually spent most of my research focusing on, those urban clusters. There's about 3,000 of those in the US. However, one of the things that kind of irked me about that is that you'd end up with these clusters that included 2 small towns that had clearly were separate and differentiated in terms of they had these separate main streets, right? They're clearly different places. They had separate municipal boundaries. And so what I wanted to do was to kind of take that, and then I also then separated those out and said, okay, we're going to account for this fact that these are separate municipalities, and we're going to take into account density and population too. So that's kind of where I've come to recently. Not all of my maps I'm going to show you include that understanding, but it's important to recognize that there's all of these challenges, even just getting to what small towns. If we do that, we end up with like 4,500 to 5,000 small towns in the US, so even more. So this is what that type of data analysis results in. And so what I'm showing here is this differentiation between large cities, which are the black dots. Those are those urban areas that have a high enough density to be considered cities, a high enough population to be considered large cities, so 50,000 and above. The green dots are cities that are within, they're separate municipalities. You would be living in that, whatever that suburb, that city's name is. But really, the census considers that to be a suburb of that larger city. So those are the green dots. And then the purple dots are my small towns that are dense. They have this, they meet the density level to be considered urban, but they have a smaller population. And then the gray dots, and you can kind of see the railroad towns trailing out in the Midwest and the Great Plains. Those gray dots are everything else. All of these other little municipalities that are officially census designated places, but they have below 2,500 population, so they're very small, very, very small places. And I didn't even bother to show the ones that were less than 100 people. There were some that were 0 people, which was interesting. So that's what I came up with when I was just trying to define what a small town is. This is what it looks like close up in Ohio. There's the, again, black dots are the cities, the green dots are the suburbs, and then the purple dots are the small towns, and the gray dots are rural areas. So it's relatively, I think, a pretty good way of defining small towns. So once you do that, you're faced with kind of this series of 3 problems that I wanted to talk about. The first problem is visibility. There's a lot of small towns. There's only so much room on a map. There's somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000, depending on how you're defining them. So visibility is an issue. If you literally map them in terms of their boundaries, that doesn't really work well at all. The urban clusters stand out very well, urban areas, which are the ones above 50,000. But you can't even see really any dark blue areas on that map at all, because those are the urban clusters, and they're physically very small. So if you zoom in, this is super, super basic. Think about it as a draft map. But this is showing, it's got labels on the urban areas, but if I were to try to label each one of those dark blue urban clusters, that wouldn't work out very well at all. So this is what happens. So one idea I had was to put dots, not surprisingly, for small towns, to leave the urban areas the way they are. And that's not bad, and some of the maps later on just use dots. But I also thought perhaps it would be helpful to show their population, to sort of size them proportionally based on their population, and I think that helps a lot to understand where small towns are. in the US. And then these are just a few examples of what I did with that once I tested out that technique. Again, not perfect, but kind of thinking about mapping. This is some of the most interesting data I found involved race and ethnicity in small towns. I think in terms of kind of going against our perceptions of what we expect small towns to be like. So this is showing just white population in small towns. And so the purple areas, particularly those with the black circles around them, are the highest percentage of people who are white within those towns. But once you start to get into the dark green dots, that's below 50% white. And so it's a little bit different than the kind of expectation we have of small towns being these kind of 95% white places. So there's a lot more diversity in small towns than we necessarily expect. So I tried, I made a map for percent Hispanic to show kind of the patterns and not surprising patterns in terms of the Central Valley of California and along the border in Texas. And then you can definitely see some of these areas in kind of the Midwest. It almost seems like the Midwest is one of the least diverse areas, rather than, I'm not sure what you would expect New England or something to be less diverse, but that Ohio, my home state, is showing up very strongly there as not being very diverse. If we map percent black this way, we can see African American populations in the South. Also not too surprising in terms of kind of regional expectations, but maybe a little surprising given what you think about in terms of small towns. Income levels also produces an interesting map. Apologies for the legibility. But you can definitely see things like some exurban effects in terms of small towns that are beyond the density of like Minneapolis, St. Paul. But clearly those are exurbs that have very high levels of income. So that was kind of interesting. This is one of my favorite maps from some of the experimenting that I was doing, which is showing areas that are above the national average in terms of manufacturing, different types of employment. So manufacturing and agriculture and some regional patterns that you might expect, but I kind of enjoy the way that ended up visualizing what's going on in these small towns and maybe teasing out some real differences and nuances that we don't necessarily expect from small towns. So a second problem that I see a lot in terms of small town mapping is really the absence of small towns in national maps and how they get erased because of generalization. So this is just a really simplified version of population density. Social Explorer has this cool feature where you can split things up into yes or no really fast. And so this is high population density above 1,000 people per square mile. If we did this just by state level, we'd have New Jersey and Rhode Island. If we do it by county level, we get some of the counties that have large cities in them, but not all of them. And then when we zoom in, we start to see some of these small towns that actually have high density populations. And so this generalization problem is something that you can really see in terms of the presidential election. And it really started to irk me when data started coming out, and it's actually incredibly hard to find at the precinct level, which is where you'd actually start to see small towns. And so you see this map of Ohio where you've got the classic red county, blue county issue. And then you've got this precinct level data that a graduate student, economics graduate student collected and mapped. And really I haven't seen a lot of, finally some of the data is becoming open source, but it was very hard to find and track down at the precinct level. But when you do that, you can start to see these blue areas, these small towns popping up as being blue, which really I felt backed up my argument that small towns are urban places because they tend to follow more urban voting patterns than rural. So this is what it looks like when you look at an Ohio map and you actually put a circle around every blue spot on the map. And so if you zoom in, you can actually start to see these small towns pop out as being blue areas that voted Democratic in the last election, which is not necessarily something that we expect. And so I had to mention, I don't know if Ken is here or not, but Ken Field's map is sometimes like, oh yeah, that shows small towns, but it doesn't. It's actually aggregated to the county level. And so if he could remake that map, Okay. If you could remake that map with precinct level data, then I would be really happy. But as it is, if you look at that, my county there is showing up as being 53% Republican in terms of how they voted. But you can see if you look at the other map that's precinct level, that Kent was actually very blue. My precinct was like 75%. I mean, we're a college town, right? 75% Democratic. So there's real differences that are being lost when we map things to the county level. Right. And so the final problem is one that I've really only started to dabble in, and so I won't take too long covering it, but it's basically this idea of context, which is, can we look at small towns and try to understand them as urban places by comparing them to their surrounding county, rather than kind of looking at them regionally where they end up kind of mirroring regional patterns. So are these small urban places actually looking different than the surrounding county? So I kind of worked out, and this isn't the best data plan. I've kind of, in retrospect, started thinking about it a little bit more. But it's a starting point, is to think about what a location quotient might look like for small towns. So compare the percentage of whatever demographic feature in the small town, and compare that to the surrounding county. So that brings up some interesting data. This is showing race data from the census. And that brings out some of the towns that have a higher percentage of African Americans, or there's very few that have a higher percentage of white population. It would be African Americans or Hispanic population is more than twice the surrounding county average, which I think is interesting. We could do that for Ancestry, which is also kind of interesting. Some places that have a much higher percentage of a particular ancestry in the small town compared to the surrounding county. Could think about this in terms of, I thought this was something that would be maybe unexpected, is that a lot of the people who work in the primary sector, they're not living out on these rural farms. They're living in the small town and working in the primary sector in one way or another, in actually many of these counties, except maybe the Central Valley, which is interesting. I thought maybe I'd find something really interesting if I looked up walk to work, and I think there's kind of a regional pattern here where you have people in the west that live in small towns are actually less likely to walk to work than their surrounding county, but more towards the east there might be a little bit more, but this was a little less satisfying conclusion than I was hoping for, because I was hoping to prove that small towns are super sustainable because everybody walks to work there. Like, no, but that's just what I do. All right, so what are the lessons learned? Originally this slide was blank because I'm not really sure exactly what my lessons are learned. This is something I've just been playing with and thinking about as I try to map my own research. But I think one thing that I would like to think that I've proved is that you can map small towns, and that maybe if you're out there doing cartography in all the different ways that you guys are doing it in, maybe it's worth kind of giving it a second thought as to whether it's worth trying to include smaller urban places in addition to larger urban places on your maps. And second, that hopefully you saw that there were some really interesting patterns there, and that small towns don't deserve to be kind of lumped in with their county. And we should actually start thinking about them as urban places that have really interesting, distinctive patterns that vary from place to place and type to type, much like the rest of US geography. Thank you. Any questions?
So if you could repeat the question.
Yeah. Sorry.
Have you been able to do any of this research specifically for the community service districts in addition to incorporated towns? Sorry. So towns that maybe have high density populations but are actually controlled by the county and they're not incorporated towns.
Sorry. Okay, so the question was whether I've been able to do this research for places that are not actually municipalities, but are high density places, high-ish. Yes, most of my research has focused on that because it was only recently that I started to try to focus on CDPs. So as long as you're using urban clusters as a definition, it actually captures those really well. So like my dissertation used data that included urban clusters, but I think I'd be interested to see which didn't fit into that category or did fit into that, like which ones got left out.
We have a town in Humboldt County that's just north that would be maybe considered in the urban cluster of the other two towns, but it's run by the county, but it's the fifth largest town in the entire county.
All right, I'm going to look it up.
Yeah,
Yes, please do. I love little obscure things that I can actually check. Any other questions?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.